South Africa's President Jacob Zuma comfortably survived a drive to impeach him last week. Just 143 of the 400 members of parliament voted in favor of the motion, with the African National Congress closing ranks behind its embattled leader. Late last month, South Africa's highest court ruled unanimously that President Zuma violated the constitution by failing to repay millions of dollars in state spending for upgrades to his personal residence. It was just the latest controversy surrounding the South African leader. Later, we'll talk with a former spokesperson for the president's cabinet and a leading member of the opposition in parliament. But we begin in Johannesburg with CCTV's Yolisa in Njamela. And Yolisa, after that impeachment vote failed, there have been increasing calls for President Zuma to step down, including from within his own party. How significant is that, and what are the chances that he will in fact resign?
Well, it's actually very significant because President Zuma, for starters, has had a tumultuous time as a president in this country. He's faced scandals, he's faced challenges throughout his presidency, but it's never been like the time that we're experiencing now, knowing that his comrades from within the political party, within the ruling party, the ANC, are calling for his head. They're asking him to resign. Those people include the ANC stalwarts from people like Ahmed Kathrada, who served, or rather served in jail with the former president of this country, the late Nelson Mandela. So it's senior people like that who are asking for Zuma to step down. Churches, businesses, ordinary folk in civil society organizations asking him to step down. But it's actually highly unlikely that President Jacob Zuma will step aside, or at least not now, because you'll know that later this year, this country will be holding the local municipal elections. President Jacob Zuma is extremely popular with the masses, and the ANC will hope that popularity will translate into votes for the party.
Yolisa, let's take a step back here. Take us through the events that led up to this court's ruling and that impeachment vote. How did we get here?
Well, it started off with the renovations at the private home of President Jacob Zuma, a homestead known as Nkandla in this country. He was found by the watchdog to have unduly benefited from public funds. He spent some $60 million renovating his house. When the watchdog of this country asked him or instructed him to pay a portion of that money, he refused, and he was saying the watchdog has no legal powers and therefore her decision is not binding. The opposition parties were relentless throughout. They took this matter to all kinds of platforms, including the highest court of the land, the Constitutional Court. That is where the Constitutional Court found, amongst other things, that President Jacob Zuma has in fact unduly benefited, and also he failed to uphold the constitution of this country. That was used by the opposition party. It gave them impetus to go to parliament and try to impeach the president. Well, they failed dismally, because you would know in this country, the African National Congress, the ruling party, have more numbers than all opposition parties combined.
Thanks, Yolisa. That's CCTV's Yolisa in Njamela reporting from Johannesburg. Joining us now from Cape Town is John Steenhuisen. He's a member of South Africa's parliament and the chief whip of the Democratic Alliance. With us from Johannesburg is Mzwanele Manyi. He previously served in the Zuma administration as spokesperson for the president's cabinet and chief executive officer of the Government Communication and Information System. Thanks to both of you for joining us. Mzwanele, as we just heard from our reporter there, President Jacob Zuma was found to have violated the constitution of South Africa when he failed to repay money that was used for improvements to his private residence. That's just the latest controversy that he's been involved in. In the past, he's been accused of rape, he's been accused of corruption. There have been some highly questionable decisions on cabinet appointments and dismissals. Should he remain president of South Africa?
Definitely, yes. I think a lot of people are confused. What you've just summarized now is not actually what actually has happened. A lot of people keep confusing the judgment of the Constitutional Court. The judgment is very clear that the actual primary offense here is the issue of not respecting, so to speak, the binding powers of the public protector. And then consequentially, then it impacts on the constitutionality of that act, as opposed to a direct act, as it were, of violating the Constitution. The word, the sentence violate the Constitution, it's not contained in that judgment. So the president, the judgment is very clear that the president acted inconsistent with that particular provision. What people now are doing in this country, which is not correct, they think that this judgment is an omnibus for everything that they don't like about the president. They put corruption charges, they put all kinds of things that are not in the judgment. All of those things have got separate processes. This judgment, people must be very clear, this judgment is not an omnibus for all the ills of this country. It was purely about clarifying, providing legal certainty about the powers of the public protector, which the Constitutional Court has done. And the Constitutional Court has actually issued 11 orders to remedy the situation, so that the president has welcomed unreservedly. So the president of this country, a very humble man, has agreed to subject himself to the highest court of this land as orders, as it were. The opposition parties, who are not law-abiding, they did not want to accept all the orders as given. They decided by themselves that this inconsistency amounts to serious misconduct, amounts to serious violation, a language which is not contained in the court order. And as a result of that, they've gone on to Parliament to try and vote out the president. And indeed, that process was allowed because members of Parliament in South Africa respect the law.
Okay.
They respect the opposition's views, even if they are wrong. But the final position on that was that the president was voted back into office, so to speak, by a democratically done process. So we should be moving on, but still, even after that process, the opposition continues to want to roam around the street and bring down the confidence of South Africa in terms of views by international investors. It's quite an irresponsible behavior by the opposition party.
All right, let me go to John. John, we're hearing there from a supporter of Jacob Zuma that this is not as serious as it's being made out, that President Zuma did make some mistakes, but they're not as serious as we're making out.
Well, I think that's Mr. Mani's impression of the matter. And I mean, one wouldn't expect anything different from him. Unfortunately, much like he failed to convince his own ANC branch, he doesn't convince the opposition and certainly doesn't convince the South African public. The Constitutional Court was very clear. It said that the president had failed to uphold the Constitution and had acted in an unlawful manner when he failed to implement the remedial actions that the public protector laid out. What Mr. Mani doesn't say is that the president has put South Africa through 6 years of political turmoil in his bid to try and exonerate himself and prevent himself from having to do the honorable thing and pay the money that he owed for the non-security upgrades to his private residence. The Constitutional Court couldn't have been more explicit that the president had failed to uphold the Constitution and had violated the law of the Republic of South Africa. And Section 89 of the Constitution of the Republic of South Africa couldn't have been more explicit, that when the president fails to uphold his oath of office, the Constitution and the laws of the Republic, that he must then be subjected to, or open himself up for a challenge in terms of being removed from office. I don't think that the Constitutional Court and the watershed nature of the judgment can simply be brushed off in the manner that Mr. Mani has said. It is a very serious matter. It's the most serious indictment of a sitting president. And as head of the executive, he should be setting the example to the rest of his cabinet. Clearly, he has failed to do so, and he should no longer serve as the head of state in South Africa and president of the Republic of South Africa. It's simply not good enough to say that he is a humble man. He's not a humble man. Even his what's so-called apology was not an apology. He said, apologize for the confusion and misunderstanding. He manufactured that confusion and misunderstanding over the last 6 years. There was not an apology, not a humble man, and unfortunately, it's simply not good enough.
Okay, let's bring in Sipho Sepe. He's a columnist and associate political editor for South Africa's oldest web-based news source and Africa's first online newspaper, The Mail and Guardian. He joins us from Johannesburg. And Sipho, what exactly is the legal impact of this Constitutional Court ruling? Did the court just say, President Zuma, you're going to have to pay the money back, or was there any other kind of legal sanction against the president in South Africa?
I think we are living in a constitutional democracy, And the parties have a right to exploit every opportunity that comes to make sure that their fortunes become better. And in this case, as Njamela indicates, that there was a clear issue of misunderstanding or what they call error in law. And it is also correct that the president could have taken a different position of simply paying back the money, but he didn't. But the long and short of it is that the matter ultimately was taken to the Constitutional Court. And the court made a determination. And the language was very strong to say he had failed to uphold and defend and respect the Constitution. And of course, the opposition parties, as they would and probably as they must, began to say, but let us test this in, as the Constitution suggests, that where there is a transgression by a head of state, the National Assembly may remove a sitting president, and they went that route. So I don't think we should actually fault them for exercising and trying to exploit every opportunity that comes. But ultimately, whether a sitting president is fit for purpose or that will be determined by the people. And Parliament represents the people. And ultimately, the matter went to Parliament, and the opposition was defeated.
Okay, let's step away from the letter of the law for a moment. Let's look at the political fallout here. Njamela, there are a number of factions within the ruling African National Congress that want President Zuma to step down, and these factions include highly respected veterans of the movement in South Africa. They also include some provincial branches of that party in South Africa. Is the president listening to what his members are saying?
Yeah, a couple of things. First, I think I'm happy that Mr. Steenhuisen makes mention of Section 89. That section is actually a proper section to talk about, which talks about the removal of the president. What is very, very clear on this judgment, that section is not even referred to anywhere in the judgment. And in terms of Section 172 of the Constitution, the Concord has got a duty and an obligation. The word used there is must. If there's anything inconsistent, whatever clause that has been inconsistent with must be referenced, must be declared unconstitutional. That Section 89, had the Constitutional Court mentioned Section 89, wouldn't be having this discussion. It would be very clear, and it would be contrary to the oath of office of MPs to vote otherwise. The reason MPs vote the way they did is because the Constitutional Court was doing its routine task. It's almost, let me just complete, it's almost like a law that is not constitutional. This is in that same realm that when you strike a law and say it's unconstitutional, you can't then say people must be fired.
Okay, look, I mean, you're talking about the letter of the law here. Let's move to the broad picture here. You know, do you think that damage has been done to South Africa's image and reputation by the president's actions? I mean, we see it here in the media. We see it in media in other parts of the world.
I think the important thing to note here is that the overwhelming majority of the people of this country have got full confidence in this government that is led by the ANC. The issue of whether the president has created damage or not is an issue that cannot be left to opposition parties to pronounce on. This opposition party, for the past 2 years, they've been raising motion of no confidence. All they want is to be in power. So they do not want to respect the will of the people as expressed by Parliament. So we can't operate with people like this that have got a superiority complex. This is what we're facing here. We've got people who've got a superiority complex who think that everything that they say and do must go.
Okay, that criticism of the president, I should say, is not just confined to the South African opposition. We've heard criticism most recently from some very influential newspapers and magazines, The Economist, The Financial Times, The New York Times. Bloomberg has just said that South Africa cannot prosper under the current president. John, what are the legal options now to remove the president?
We'll get to that, but I mean, I also just want to say that I noticed Mr. Mani very deftly sidestepped the internal ructions within his own party as a result of the president's action. I mean, this is spilling over into the public arena on a daily basis. You've got branches, you've got provincial executives, all turning on President Zuma, realizing the ANC itself with many of its branches what a liability the president is. In terms of options going forward, we have a constitutional democracy. We didn't have a democracy that allowed for a tyranny of the majority. I believe that Section 89 of the Constitution is very clear. The truth of the matter is the Constitutional Court was never going to rule that the president must step down, because that would be overstepping their boundary in terms of the separation of powers. But the language that they used and the manner in which they couched their judgment was unambiguous, that the president had failed to uphold the Constitution and had acted in an unlawful manner, clearly meeting the prescripts of Section 89 of the Constitution. And however Mr. Money wants to spin that, that is the language that was used. And so there are a number of options we are going to use going forward. But chief amongst these is mobilizing South African civil society and South African voters across the spectrum to send a very strong message to the African National Congress and the coming local government elections. Mr. Mani says that the ANC enjoys the full, and President Zuma enjoys the full support of the South African public. Well, that's untested yet. The local government elections coming up later this year provide a perfect referendum for ordinary South Africans to express themselves on the misconduct of the president and his unsuitability for office. And if the ANC want to tough it out with him as president, we in the opposition say bring it on. You couldn't create a more perfect environment for us to head into an election with a lame duck president who's been constitutionally exposed by the highest court in the land.
Okay, we are going to have to take a break right now.